My parents sold my studio to fund a startup, but what they signed away wasn't fully disclosed in the contract. They didn't just steal my home, they sold off a piece of my soul, a legacy woven into the very walls, and they did it with my own name forged on the papers. The architects of my betrayal weren't strangers, but my own family. The stale scent of turpentine and old coffee still clung to the air in my Berlin studio, a quiet promise of unfinished work. Outside, the city hummed a steady, unfamiliar rhythm, its ancient stone buildings whispering stories under a perpetually shifting, bruised twilight sky. Inside, a canvas waited, bathed in the soft, melancholic light of late afternoon, mirroring the fragile, almost foolish hope that had begun to bloom within me. My name is Chloe, and I'm 31. For most of my adult life, my address was a third-floor loft in an old factory block. It used to smell like rust and wet concrete, a gritty testament to its industrial past. Then the city found its charm. String lights appeared in the alleyways, where houses transformed into chic galleries, and the rent, inevitably, turned predatory. My loft wasn't a flex. It was a scar and a sanctuary. It wasn't just a space, it was a history. It belonged to my Grandpa Arthur before it belonged to me. Grandpa Arthur, the painter, the man who raised me after my grandmother died, when my parents, Eleanor and Richard, became little more than busy, distant silhouettes. He taught me how to stretch a canvas tight enough to sing when you tapped it, how to find beauty in overlooked corners, and how silence could be a weapon if you aimed it right. He taught me to look at a blank wall until it stopped feeling like a threat, until it became an invitation. When he died, he left me the loft. Not because it was valuable, though later it certainly became that, but because it was mine in a family where mine always felt temporary, conditional. In my family, my brother Ethan was always the future. He'd been perpetually about to break through since college. Always one investor away, one pitch away, one miracle away from his inevitable empire. Eleanor and Richard spoke about him like he was a sunrise they personally scheduled, an event they had meticulously planned and were now just waiting to unveil. I was the other thing, the talented but unstable daughter. The one whose success was treated like an interesting accident, a pleasant anomaly. My exhibitions were nice. My commissions were fun. My work, my very passion, was a phase that had simply lasted long enough to make them uncomfortable, to make them question its practicality. The arrangement was simple. I earned, I helped, I didn't ask for too much. I was useful. I was tolerated. Berlin broke that spell. For 3 months, I was gloriously anonymous. No one asked me to be practical. No one called to borrow my competence, my skills, my time. I painted until my wrists ached, until my chest felt open and exposed, raw with new ideas. I started a series I'd been afraid of for years. Work about inheritance, about being loved only when convenient, about rooms that remember. I flew home with charcoal permanently under my nails and a stupid, hopeful plan. Finished the series in my loft, in the sacred light my grandpa used to chase across those very windows. The taxi turned onto my street, and my brain simply refused to believe what my eyes saw. Scaffolding. A monstrous, metal skeleton of poles and netting, wrapping my building like it had been packaged for shipping, a cage around my sanctuary. Men in hard hats moved with an unnerving confidence, like they owned the very sidewalk. A monstrous dumpster squatted out front, overflowing with broken drywall and splintered wood, piled inside like shattered bones. I got out before the driver had even fully stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs. The front door was propped open with a bucket, a crude invitation to chaos. Inside, the hallway looked skinned alive. Mailboxes ripped out, posters stripped, paint scraped down to pale, ghost-like rectangles. The air tasted like dust and destruction. "Can I help you?" a man called out. He held a tablet in one hand and possessed that peculiar calm you only get when you have unquestioned permission. "I'm Chloe," I said, forcing my voice steady, trying to push past the knot of dread forming in my stomach. "Unit 3C. That's my studio." He tapped the screen, a perfunctory gesture. 3C, he repeated, his voice flat. "Full renovation. Your items were moved to storage. New owners started demolition yesterday. New owners. The words hit me like a bucket of icy water. I didn't sell, I whispered, the air suddenly thick and cold. He gave me a look that was polite, professional, and utterly final. I'm sorry, ma'am. I just worked the schedule. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Eleanor. Asterisk, don't dramatize. We made a reasonable business decision. Ethan needed capital, proof of assets for a closing round. You can paint anywhere. Asterisk, I read it twice, 3 times, each word a fresh wound. My throat tightened until it felt like I'd swallowed sand. Some stupid, naive part of me, the old Chloe, still believed in misunderstandings. I called. Richard answered first. Chloe, he said, like I was merely late for dinner. You're back. There was no warmth, no welcome, just a detached acknowledgement. Did you sell my studio? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. A pause. Not shock, not guilt, just a flicker of irritation, as if I'd asked him to explain a complicated bill. It was an investment, he said, his tone carefully neutral. For the family. For Ethan, I countered, the name a bitter taste on my tongue. Don't do that, he warned, his voice hardening. Eleanor cut in, her voice smooth as a freshly honed knife, dripping with patronizing concern. You're spiraling, honey. I'm standing in front of my building, I snapped, my voice finally breaking. They're ripping it apart. And you'll be fine, she said, bright and certain, completely unburdened. You always are. You can paint anywhere. Then, from the background, I heard Ethan's laugh. A careless, easy sound that did something ugly to me, something primal and cold. Put him on, I said, my voice dangerously low. He took the phone like he was doing me a favor. Chloe, he said, already tired, already put upon. I didn't want you to find out like this. Like what? I demanded, the words tearing out of me. With my walls in a dumpster? I needed liquidity, he rattled off, like he'd swallowed a corporate pitch deck. Timing mattered. It's not personal. It's a space. It's my grandpa. I choked out, the words raw. It's a room, he corrected, sharper now, impatient. And you don't even use it efficiently. I'm building something scalable. Investors don't wait for feelings. I waited for Eleanor, for Richard, for either of them to scold him, to show some flicker of parental disapproval at his cruelty. They didn't. Silence, I learned that day, is an answer. I hung up. That night, I didn't cry. I couldn't. Anger held me upright, a rigid spine I hadn't known I possessed. It was a cold, pure anger that incinerated any possibility of tears. I called Sarah. Sarah wasn't a friend I drank with. She was a lawyer I'd met through a collector who appreciated art and lawsuits with equal, zealous appetite. Sarah dealt in facts. She didn't flinch at tears, but she didn't feed them either. Send me everything, she said, her voice brisk, efficient. Texts, emails, anything you have that shows how they presented the sale. And don't talk to them without me. In her office the next morning, she read my documents with a slow, meticulous attention my parents had never once given to anything I created. There's a problem with the way this was sold, she finally said, looking up. What kind of problem? My stomach sank, a familiar, heavy dread, even before she finished. Not a use covenant, she said, like she was correcting a misconception I hadn't even had. It's split ownership. Your grandpa set it up years ago. I blinked. Split? How? The building shell and the unit interior are legally separate, Sarah explained, tapping the page in front of her. The developer can buy the building. The HOA can control common structures. But the interior improvements, the studio build-out, the airspace rights tied to Unit 3C, those belong to you, separately. They're not theirs to convey. I stared at her, the pieces of her words slowly locking into place. So, my parents couldn't sell it? They could sell what they thought was the studio, she clarified. The shell interest, the line on a brochure. But they couldn't sell the part that has value. Not without you. Sarah pulled out the recorded sale packet. My signature was on it. Not mine, not really, but close enough to pass through people who process paper like fast food. Worse was the attached letter, typed in formal, poisonous language. It described me as an eccentric artist with a history of instability, someone unable to manage assets responsibly, requiring family oversight. I sat there, reading myself being turned into a liability. Not a daughter, but a problem with a neatly packaged solution. They didn't just steal, I said, my voice sounding far away, detached. They tried to erase me. Sarah's eyes were steady, unwavering. They tried to make you disposable, she said, her voice quiet but firm. That's intent. Then she did what my family never did. She acted like what had happened to me mattered. We filed an emergency motion, a stop work request, fraud allegations, notice to the developer that the interior rights weren't conveyed, notice that any continued demolition risked damages for destruction of property not owned by the buyer. By afternoon, Eleanor had called 12 times. I let it ring. The old me would have answered, desperate to keep the peace. The new me watched the phone like it was a venomous snake, mesmerized but unmoving. 2 days later, they showed up at my temporary rental, sweeping in like they were arriving to correct a wayward employee. Eleanor walked in without asking, her designer bag clutched tight. Richard hovered behind her, eyes tired, looking like a man who'd been forced into an uncomfortable performance. Ethan stood off to the side, phone in hand, as if he wanted proof of my unreasonableness. You look awful, Eleanor announced, her eyes raking over me. Thanks, I replied, the sarcasm the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. We need to talk like adults, she said, cutting right to the chase. You forged my signature, I stated, the accusation hanging heavy in the small room. Richard flinched, a quick, almost imperceptible twitch. Ethan looked away, just for half a second, but it was fast, fleeting, and utterly guilty. Eleanor didn't blink. We did what we had to do. For Samuel. For the family, she corrected, as if that made it wholly, unassailable. Ethan stepped forward, impatience leaking from him like a slow drip. The injunction is spooking people, he complained, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. This is affecting my runway. I have a round closing. I need assets on paper. I need stability. My walls are in a dumpster, I said, looking at him, a cold, hard knot in my chest. But sure, your runway. He scowled. Stop making everything emotional. We'll get you a new studio. A better one. A replacement, I repeated, the words tasting like ash, like you're buying me a new history. Eleanor's jaw tightened. You're sentimental. That's your weakness. There it was again. How they labeled whatever in me didn't serve them. You can paint anywhere, she said, slow and scolding, like she was talking to a difficult child. You don't need that building. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and something inside me snapped into crystal clarity. They weren't confused. They weren't sorry. They were only annoyed that I was resisting, that I was no longer playing my assigned role. Sarah told me to meet them at the site. Not for closure, she emphasized, but for positioning. For witnesses. For the moment that would turn their carefully constructed story inside out. The sky was gray when we met under the scaffolding, the metal structure looming over us like a skeletal predator. The netting shivered in the wind, a cheap curtain trying to hide a crime. Eleanor stared at the building as if it personally offended her. Look, she huffed. It's progress. You should be grateful. Ethan's eyes were red-rimmed, not from remorse, but from stress. Just call this off, he pleaded, his voice tight. We can fix it. Please, Chloe, please. From him. Please sounded like a demand wearing a softer shirt. Eleanor turned to me, irritated. Stop enjoying this. I almost laughed. Almost. She repeated her favorite line, a spell she truly believed in. You can paint anywhere. I smiled. Ethan snapped. What's funny? That question, sharp, suspicious, finally felt honest. Because they could smell a shift in power, and it terrified them. I said quietly, the studio you sold was actually…
And I stopped.
Silence, Grandpa Arthur had taught me, is pressure. I let it build. Eleanor's eyes widened. Finish, she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. Sarah stepped forward, a slim folder in her hand, and held out one page. Her movements were not dramatic. They were surgical. Your parents didn't sell what they think they sold, Sarah stated, her voice clear and precise. This transaction doesn't convey Unit 3C's interior rights. It doesn't convey the studio build-out. It doesn't convey the airspace rights tied to the unit. Those belong to Chloe alone. For one perfect second, nobody spoke. Then Ethan's face drained of all color. Interior rights? He stammered, his voice thin. Eleanor laughed, a brittle, sharp sound. That's not a thing. It is, Sarah said calmly. And if your contractor keeps tearing out what you don't own, we add destruction and conversion to the list of charges. Richard's voice came out small, defeated. Chloe, we didn't know. You didn't read, I said, my voice calm as a knife sliding in. You didn't care enough to read. It never belonged to you to sell. And that's when they started screaming. Eleanor first, a raw, furious sound, like she could scare the law away with sheer volume. You did this to punish us, she shrieked, her face contorted. You're jealous. You've always been jealous. Ethan grabbed his hair, his voice cracking into full-blown panic. Fix it, he pleaded, wildeed. Chloe, fix it. Call them. Tell them it's fine. Tell them. Tell them what? I asked, my voice steady amidst their unraveling. That you're entitled to my life? He stepped closer, desperate. You owe me. You always help. Eleanor jabbed a finger at my chest. You're selfish, she spat, tears of rage springing to her eyes. You're ruining your brother. I looked at her and heard my grandpa Arthur's voice in my head, soft as peppermint. Silence can be a weapon, so I used it. I let their words hang in the dust-filled air. I let the workers hear. I let the site manager stare. I let the developer representative, who had arrived mid-screaming, watch my family unravel like a cheap seam. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Any further contact goes through my office, she said, her gaze sweeping over them like a spotlight. Approach Chloe again, and we add harassment. The forged signature is criminal. The sale is defective. Work on the interior is frozen. Frozen. That word landed like a gavel strike. Before the court date, I went to the storage unit the foreman had mentioned. It was on the edge of town, a maze of roll-up doors and fluorescent hum, the kind of anonymous place where people hid divorces and dead relatives in cardboard boxes. A clerk slid a key across the counter without looking at my face. Unit 48B. Sign here. Inside, my life sat stacked like forgotten luggage. Canvases wrapped in plastic, crates labeled in black marker. My grandpa Arthur's old wooden stool was wedged between a stranger's abandoned dresser and a box of someone's old Christmas lights. The stool had a gouge in the seat from when I was 12 and dropped a palette knife. My first tiny crime, my first lesson that accidents leave evidence. I put my hand on the wood, tracing the imperfection, and finally, my body let me feel it. Not the big, cinematic grief, the kind that lets you fall apart. This was the smaller, nastier kind. The kind that makes your eyes burn and your jaw lock, because crying feels too much like surrender. Eleanor called while I was standing there. Of course she did. I answered that one. Not because I owed her, but because I wanted to hear the temperature of her voice, now that consequences had shown up in the driveway. She didn't say hello. Sarah is threatening your father, she snapped, her voice tight with fury. She's naming your choices, I said, my voice flat calm. This is insanity. Eleanor hissed. We were trying to save your brother. By selling me, I said. A pause. Then that weaponized softness. Honey, please. You're taking this too far. I looked at the stool, at the dried paint trapped in its grain like fingerprints, a fossilized moment in time. Too far was forging my name, I said. Richard's voice came on, low and tired. Chloe, were your parents? No, I said. Your people who had access. Ethan grabbed the phone, loud, frantic, his previous arrogance stripped away, revealing raw fear. I can't lose everything, he blurted. This round collapses, without collateral. This is my life. Just sign something. Tell them you approve. We'll make it up to you. Make it up. I repeated, almost amused by the sheer audacity. With what? With another lie? He swallowed hard, and for the first time, I heard fear without arrogance underneath it. Chloe, please. The old me would have softened. The old me would have heard that please and rushed to be the person who fixes things, who makes everything okay. I didn't. I couldn't. Not after seeing my own signature turned into a costume for their deceit. I'm hanging up, I said. If you call again, it goes through Sarah. At the hearing, Eleanor and Richard sat behind their attorney in clothes that screamed respectability, a carefully constructed facade. Eleanor kept her chin lifted, as if she were being wronged by the very concept of rules. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. Ethan couldn't sit still, his knee bouncing like a metronome for panic. Sarah didn't perform. She laid out facts like bricks, building an unassailable wall. The split ownership, the forged signature, the defamatory letter about my instability. The clear timeline showing the sale was rushed to meet Ethan's funding deadline. The judge's face didn't change, but his questions got colder, sharper, as the minutes passed. When he granted the stop work order, Ethan's whole body sagged, like someone had cut a string holding him upright. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor tried one last time. She stepped into my path, her eyes glossy, with a mix of fury and something close to desperation. You're doing this because you hate us, she whispered, her voice laced with venom. I looked at her carefully, like I was finally seeing the true, stark structure of her. No, I said. I'm doing this because I finally love me more than your approval. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Then her expression sharpened, hardening into something ugly and familiar, the look she saved for inconvenient truths. You always had to be dramatic, she spat, turning away as if I were a stranger who'd merely inconvenienced her day. Maybe I was. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first healthy thing I'd ever been in that family. A few weeks later, the sale was officially unwound, at least the part that could be. The developer negotiated to salvage the shell project, but the interior rights stayed where they'd always been, with me. The forgery investigation took on its own life, a slow-moving but relentless beast. Ethan's investors stopped taking his calls. My parents started speaking in the language of consequences for the first time in their lives. And the city, through a program Grandpa Arthur had quietly partnered with years ago, offered me stewardship of the space I'd built my work in. Not ownership the way a greedy person means it, but responsibility, authority, a key that didn't depend on anyone's approval. The first time I walked back into my loft, it didn't feel like home. The walls were scarred. The floor was bare concrete. But the light still arrived, stubborn as ever, cutting through the dust and landing on the spot where my easel used to stand. I stood in the middle of the wreckage and waited for grief to swallow me whole. Instead, I felt something steadier. They hadn't destroyed my life. They destroyed an illusion. The one where I kept earning my place in my own family by perpetually paying for it. I pulled a piece of charcoal from my bag. My fingers didn't shake. I found a fresh panel of drywall that hadn't been painted yet, a clean slate, and drew the first line. Dark, certain, unapologetic. They wanted to turn this place into capital. I turned it back into meaning. And if there's a moral to this story, it's this. The moment your family sees you as a resource, they stop being family the second you stop being useful. That moment hurts like hell until you realize it's also the first moment you finally belong to yourself. What would you have done in my place? Would you have fought back or tried to keep the peace? Do you think my actions were justified? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.